Hi, EDUC 456ers. That's kind of an awkward title, but not sure what else to call our cohort. Um, this lecture, sort of a lecture, I guess it's a lecture, is intended to give you sort of a 10,000 foot overview of what we know about assessment to frame our work through the semester. I guess to have you hear from me about what I believe and what I've come to practice in relation to assessment. And then the second thing is I'm positioning it now both because it's the beginning of our semester and also because you're heading into this infographic task. And really, in your assessment glossary, you've had an opportunity to kind of look broadly. I'm hoping that in the infographic you can synthesize from that breadth to consider what really matters to you, frame sort of a big idea that you can present in a provocative um, sort of thesis within your infographic. Because I don't want you to get lost in like all the definitions of the glossary and think that what assessment is knowing a whole bunch of terms. We need to be able to put that together into a bigger vision that guides our assessment practice. So, in this lecture, I'm trying to provide you with a little bit of background in order to do that and to support that process. Know that it's not my intent that after this lecture, um, you're going to have that all figured out, but rather this is one of the steps towards that. We're going to work on it more in our Zoom meeting and then further in our coming weeks. Um, so yeah, let's dive in. Um, as you can see, the frame of this very first question um, is really important to me. Knowing what the purpose of assessment really is critical. This is from policy at Rocky View schools, and I would say that in all of the major school districts in the Calgary area, probably the Alberta area, you'd see not necessarily all practice aligning to this kind of a statement, but certainly um, people in school district leadership positions, school administrators, teacher professional learning would share this idea that what assessment is ultimately about is promoting student learning. Um, there's other things that are wrapped around assessment, like reporting, um, like for a variety of purposes, reporting to parents, reporting to the Ministry of Education to give them a big picture sense of how the system is working and what funding and supports the system needs. Um, Certainly, some of our practices around awards and scholarships, university entrance, all do get wrapped around what we do with assessment in Alberta. Um, but they shouldn't be conflated with what the primary purpose is and what we need to make sure that we're doing. And the first thing to acknowledge is that some of our assessment practices that are driven by other things um, might actually do the opposite. Rather than promoting student learning, they can hinder student learning. Um, so we want to really think about when we're designing assessment how is it serving students and their learning journey. And in this little overview, I'm going to try to give you some answers or at least open some questions uh, towards getting at that. All right. Joe Bowers is an educator in Alberta. Sadly, he passed away early in his life, but his a lot of his legacy work is still available. He had a blog that was a go-to for many Alberta educators. Assessment was his jam, and I really like this quote. I think he was. We can really get tied up with the way that our online grade books and portals um, can shape what we're thinking when we're thinking about assessment and a spreadsheet mentality. I think that he was representing here is um, really pushing us to think about assessment as some sort of objective endeavor meant to evaluate and rank and unequivocally position students relative to a standard um, and we forget that it really should be an ongoing process or conversation of growth. Um, And that doesn't mean that we don't, at the end of the day, come to a professional judgment that clearly lets stakeholders know where students stand relative to the criteria. But we don't want to shape our whole practice as if that's what we're doing. What we're trying to do is work with individual students to help them come to know who they are, what their next learning steps are, what they can do, and what they need to do next. And then summative assessment comes at the end of the day, and we can look over that range of evidence and come to that declaration that we need to make in the context of reporting. Um, but we shouldn't shape everything as if that's all that we're doing. Really, we're helping students grow. Okay, so we know some things about this. Funny, I says 3 important things our profession knows, but there's 4 listed. um, these are things that I would say are they're I mean, I'm careful with the word true, um, but I feel that I have a lot of experience both as a researcher and as a practitioner to help me speak to these things. We want to help students know that they are capable of uh, improving um, themselves, and we want to shape assessment so that they see how it's serving them in that way. You all can probably think of a time in school where you were led to believe that you weren't good at something. And often it's frequent testing and high stakes um, focus on grading and rewards that can get people feeling that way. It doesn't serve kids who are always being told that they're doing great. It doesn't serve those who are always being told they're not doing great, particularly if it's not framed around next steps. So we really have a lot of research promoting this idea of a growth mindset. We need to think about our practice in that relation. Um, formative assessment, formative assessment, formative assessment. This is, you know, prevalent in the readings from our first week. The formative assessment umbrella could, incorporate both assessment for and as learning. And since the Black and Wilm Beyond the Black Box study, which was a late '90s study out of the UK, that really was a meta-analysis to show without a shadow of a doubt the importance of formative assessment. Feedback is the learning process. We know that whether I'm learning to walk, watching my child learn to walk, and how many times she falls down, that feedback is what informs her next steps. It doesn't necessarily always need to be somebody evaluating someone else. It's feedback in the case of formative assessment is understanding how you're doing, understanding whether what you're doing is working, and then using that information to try some more. How do we structure our practice so that that's what we're encouraging? We need to be able to take risks to do that. We need to fail. We need to be able to have more chances. So what does that mean for the tools we create? Research really is clear about self-assessment, and boy, shouldn't this be the goal. Getting people to a place where they leave our system knowing their own learning process, how to set their own criteria, how to look for exemplars, how to keep track of things, how to reflect on the things they're looking at and consider their next steps, to know who they are as a thinker, and to be reflective or metacognitive of that. And then lastly, of the four things, um, we need to give assistance where assistance is needed. This idea of just again and again telling people they can't do something, pushing them into things they can't yet do, um, like it's just ridiculous if you think about it. Moving kids along into increasingly difficult things when they consistently haven't done it, and then not providing them with the support so that it's an appropriate challenge. Um, you know, it really makes no sense. Especially, we have this time is always running out idea, yet we have students for 13 years K to 12. how do we think about that as a bigger continuum and as a long time to help students work towards their own next steps, and giving them the support they need to do that. And that challenges a lot of the standardized pieces that we have in place in our systems. And yeah, more on that to come. Okay, don't believe me about this research. I got to put a caveat when I quote John Hattie. Certainly, I have some real problems with meta-analysis. John Hattie's work looks at, as it says here, 300 million students in 70,000 studies and makes claims across time and space and culture. And so I'm careful to use, and obviously all by standardized exams and the like in order to make claims like this. So even when assessing with that as a lens, right? Even without taking into context, without looking at maybe there's more to learning than standardized test results, etc. When Hattie does this work and comes to he comes to a whole list of top effect sizes, but these 5 in his 2016 work, all in my mind really speak to assessment practice. The teacher credibility piece certainly, I guess, is not completely directly assessment practice, but the other one, students reporting their own progress, focusing on students' thinking, giving assistance to students who need extra help, and using assessment for learning methods. Not only these things help students do better on large-scale, summative, standardized assessments. So if we want to improve that, it's not by giving students more and more versions of the PAT. It's by giving them these things, and then have the PAT at the end of the day, and they will improve because we're focusing on student learning with our assessment practice, rather than evaluation all along. Okay, so what does this look like? Here's 6 good practices from me that could have been probably framed differently, but here's a shot at them. Again, not meant to be exhaustive or anything like that, but 6 that come to mind for me. First of all, collecting and reporting evidence by learning outcomes. Calgary Board, Rockview Schools, Foothills School Division, certainly I know those better. I know you are from all over the province, and there will be some different practices in different places, but I would say the trend in our province and in our profession is to move towards this idea of outcomes-based assessment or standards-based assessment. What does that mean? Well, when I first started teaching, people would organize their grade books. They'd have mathematics, and then within that, they'd have like a folder for tests, a folder for quizzes, a folder for homework, a folder for assignments. Each of those would have a percentage, and then all of the tests would go into the test. All the marks for tests would go into the test folder. We might weight that at like 60% because they're somehow supposedly cumulative or worth more. And then it would the computer, after we put in all these grades organized by these assessment tools, they would give us a percentage, and then that information would be given as a grade or as a percentage, and students would have a 75 in mathematics and a B. The problem with that is then you look at it and you say, oh, okay, well, I did bad on tests, but better on quizzes, or I did better on this test than that test. But it's hard with that information to use it for anything. So where we're moving to instead is organizing grade books, the way we report, the way we collect evidence around outcomes. Not every outcome in our program of study, but this is an example from the Calgary Board report card where they've got Mathematics 8 into understands mathematical concepts and relationships. They call these STEMs. You can read them. So now what we're going to do is, rather than collect things around tests, we're going to look at a test, still use some of the exact same tools, but now we want to look at which of the questions we're having a student use mathematical reasoning to analyze and solve problems. And now let's put that grade into this bucket. which ones were representing and communicating mathematical ideas? How did they do on that? Um, Here's an example from Rocky View schools, the way that they look at English language arts, science. You can see there, um, where are we demonstrating and applying knowledge? Where are we using knowledge to explain, interpret, predict, solve problems? Where in this project did we have the opportunity to demonstrate scientific inquiry, explain, interpret, or make predictions? So now if we're collecting our evidence around these stems or outcomes, we can start looking at trends over time. Students can use this information to know what they're good at and what they need to do next. Students can use this information between units of study. Science, for example, we go from, waste in our world to lights and shadows. That seems like a totally new topic. What am I carrying forward? Well, certainly it's these, rather than organizing our science reporting by those topics, organizing it by these outcomes that we can work on in multiple topic areas and over between grades. How does that look like pragmatically? Well, here's an example from a rubric I developed in grade 7 social studies where the exact same deliverable, in this case, historical narrative fiction, was able to give student, I'm looking at the same piece of work and my rubric can draw to a specific language arts outcomes and to specific social studies outcomes. And here's another example. We could have, instead of 1 mark on a test, we could have something like this that's showing us in how, in a math context, we can start to look at giving more detailed assessment that helps students recognize what they were able to demonstrate, understanding of what it would look like for them to close that gap, and then break that down by outcome. So this practice changes the way, again, many of the same tools can be used. People will take a test and just find the questions that are what outcomes those are hitting, and then be able to organize, or a rubric for an essay that we would already ask people to do. But rather than organize our gradebook by these specific tools, we're going to organize them by the outcome, and then have a better picture of what students can do and how they can do that across multiple items. Further to that, collecting a triangulation of evidence. This is an Ann Davies concept, observations, conversations, products. Traditionally, assessment practice are really heavy on the products. We have all sorts of products, but we know that not all of the things that we're seeking to understand of what a student can do are best shown in product, and not all students can best represent their understanding in a product, especially if those products are heavily one medium. Things can certainly all become a reading and writing test if in science we're always needing to read and write our understanding. We're never able to show how we can do science in other ways. Just as one particular example, a phys ed context is a great one. Phys ed teachers rely heavily on observations. They don't have nearly as many products, and that's appropriate. But they do seek to sometimes have some products, and conversations is where we're going to talk to students about what they can do. We can give students an opportunity to explain what they know, which sometimes is harder to see. For example, as a phys ed teacher, if I'm trying to observe how a student is engaging in a basketball game, it's also helpful to have that student tell me what they were trying to do and what their actions were intended towards, and how that met the outcome I was looking at. So we really want to think, it's not this looks equilateral, like we should have equal number of all of them. I don't think that's necessarily true. I think the type of what we're asking students to do will define that, but we need to think beyond the collection of products. Here's directly from the Calgary Board of Education website. I like how it says here, at the end of their unit of study, students and teachers can assess progress in reference to the criteria and decide on next steps of learning. A teacher then uses the most recent evidence of achievement to determine a final grade. This is really important It's got the list: rubrics, labs, tests, performance-based observations, feedback, conversations, quizzes, portfolios. Rather than weighting all of these, now that we've got them organized by outcome, now that we're giving students a chance to show what they can do in a variety of ways, we can then look across that evidence, make a professional judgment about what they can do, take recency into mind. So they didn't know about or weren't able to do that thing at the beginning of the year, but they can show us just before reporting period consistently, or say they can't do it in a multiple choice test, but can do it when working with a lab. They can do it when explaining it to us. They can do it when making something for a project. Why would I just put all that as an average and then determine that they can sort of do it? What I need to be able to say is they can do it in this way. This is what they need to work on next because they can't show it in this way. But I need that evidence organized by outcome, and I need a range of different things so that I can get to that diagnostic place to actually help a student move forward. I don't know how many students I've had that, whether it's test anxiety, whether it's the format of a multiple choice test, don't show all of what they know in that format and then get continually sent the message that they don't know things or they need to try harder or work harder. What we really needed to diagnose was that what it was they needed to work on and then make a plan for that. And that's really what having multiple sources of evidence and organizing them around outcomes allows us to do. Similarly, this particular bullet point speaks to our need to practice. Chefs prepare hundreds of recipes in developing their palate. Mechanics work as an apprentice to gain experience. We need to be able to refine skills and gain competence through practice, reflection, and feedback. And if every time our mistakes are being assessed, every time our mistakes are pulling our mark down, it really doesn't create that environment. And it's really through making those mistakes and getting feedback and knowing that the feedback is actionable and we can move it forward. So these first two things really set up formative assessment, which we're going to talk about soon. Okay, I hope I'm not speaking too fast or on too much of a soapbox. Designing authentic assessments. This is really important too. What do we really want students to be able to do in the world with this information? How do we design for transfer? How do we ensure that if we're the basketball coach, at the end of the day, they can, this player, the student can make free throws in the context of the game, not just mark them on assess them all the time on their ability to do the mechanics of a free throw shot, and then never give them the opportunity to do it for real and hope that one day they transfer it. What we need. And that's not even thinking that maybe the goal of phys ed isn't to be the best free throw shooter, but rather to be healthy and well in the world and be a team player and take leadership and understand self and some of these broader concepts. So in assessment, we always need to begin with what are the big ideas in our program study? What is it that we really want students to be able to do? What would it look like if students could transfer that effectively in the world? And then how do we design, aim, create performance opportunities and products that are going to give students a chance to do that, so that we can scaffold to that, so that all the isolated skills that they need to make that all come together, we can build, but we can do that within the context of doing something real, and therefore support them with transfer and actually give them a representation in their final grade of what they can do and use. So that begins in our process of assessment practice on thinking about what really matters and thinking about what it would look like to transfer that learning effectively. And competencies help with that. That process of building STEMs helps with that, that we looked at earlier, but is really foundational to assessment, is not making sure we understand the forest for the trees and organizing our assessment around big ideas. And then communicating in that way as well, building our rubrics towards that, and our performance tasks towards that. And then many of these smaller component parts get built in as scaffolding steps and are still immensely important, but should be organized around transferring learning effectively. Focus on formative assessment. This is a big one. I think we can think about formative assessment in a variety of ways. In our course, they break it down into assessment for learning and assessment as learning. For me, assessment for learning is all about assessing kind of diagnostically so that both the teacher and the student know what to do next in teaching and learning. How are we planning to collect evidence all the time and then working to interpret that evidence to inform what needs to happen next? This is a list from Willem and Leahy, 2015, about formative assessment. Um, you know, I like this, providing feedback that moves learning forward. I like the idea of engineering effective discussions, tasks, activities that within the context of a lesson elicit evidence of learning and lets us quick check-ins. Um, Whether it's there's lots of different tools for this, but designing so that we know how what students need to know, what they know, um, and building that into the way we think about our role is to design for feedback and then to respond for feedback. If somebody's created a whole unit in advance and they're gonna, of the year, and they've got all their PowerPoints and all their tests created and they know how that's going to roll out, um, that's a standardized model that we're just then implementing on people. What we really need to design for is to begin with, what are the students' understanding and questions? How am I going to know what those are? What tools will help me understand that? How will I know in each lesson or activity or in the development of a project or authentic assessment what they need, what they know, what I need to teach next, what individuals need for their skill building. A lot of our literacy and numeracy programs are built around doing this. We get further and further away from this in our high school practice, but we really need, I think, and the evidence is really clear that it's designing for this feedback to move learning forward and to understand the next teaching and learning steps. That's so important. Um, Connected to this, I always want to ask myself this question: how am I going to support students to receive critique and then to act on that critique and make revision? Um, this can be from self, peer, instructor, expert, but it shouldn't be some optional thing or a thing that students have to figure out how to do themselves. I'm going to talk about that more in the self-assessment one that's coming. But building feedback loops into all that we do, structuring a classroom so I can have that small group time, or I can receive those products and give that feedback asynchronously, and have students work with them is critical importance. Um, uh, I'm going to give you a quick example. Some of you have seen this work. I think if you were in my Spec 1 social studies class, I have I like to create big unit plans. This is one example from grade 7 humanities, and having all of these scaffolding steps to help me build students towards their deliverable. I'm just going to flip over to it quickly so you can see what I'm talking about. In this learning contract, students are told right from the start, um, what their task is, how that's and how that's being framed. But then all of these learning steps are about me supporting them to build the skills and get feedback on it. So rather than them just writing a story, we're going to begin with them uncovering steps with how they uncover what the story is going to be able to get feedback on that from peers. What's their climax? How are they planning that? How can they get feedback from me and from peers? Then think through their character, get feedback on their character and their idea of that, so they can improve and make changes. Think through their setting. Now build a storyboard, have a rough copy that articulates itself into working with peers to get feedback. Here's an example. Matthias wrote his letter to Alexander Mackenzie. Then you'll see that Christine, Jasmine, and Kennedy came in and provided feedback in the colors. Now here's Christine's letter. Then after this process of peer critique, having teacher go through and give instructor critique, sometimes having an expert that has been a part of our process, community member, etc. Give feedback can be another powerful piece, and really scaffolding each and every one of these steps Here's an example from a different context about giving specific actionable feedback rather than, if I can zoom in here, you can see in this math context, the teacher's work is in green, specific asking questions. Remember the show your work thing that we used to see when we were students? Um, how do we not only have students show their work, but then give them explicit feedback on what they're doing well and what they need to do next, and building that into the way that we structure our assessment practice. Um, okay, zooming back out a little bit, scaffolding towards self-assessment. Again, if we go back to Hattie at the very beginning, this was the number one, reporting their own progress. Beyond reporting for me is this idea of giving students ownership, supporting students to take ownership over their own learning journey, to be able to identify their own next steps, what they can do, what they need to do next. They can start to make the adjustments themselves to what they need. So what does this require? For me, it requires, first of all, there needs to be a purpose behind their work. I've had grade 7 students say to me, you know what, Mr. Hill, I'm done. I'm not going to do another round of feedback. It's good enough. What my mark be now? A C? I'll take the C. Instead, they need to know that what they're doing has a purpose beyond the game of school, beyond grades, a real audience, or a skill that they know that's meaningful, that's going to have that performance assessment piece to it. So that's important. It's important to give students criteria so that they know what makes something good. They need to get comfortable with that criteria. That might be co-developing criteria. It might be using the criteria to look at exemplars. It might be working with the criteria with peers, talking about criteria in relation to work. They need practice self-assessing. They need feedback on how they're self-assessing, and then they need accountability. In that Champlain's Dream example I briefly showed, before the students would hand me their revised copy, I would have them hand it along with the form that said, what is the important peer feedback you heard and what changes did you make? So that they're held accountable. I can see how they're using that process. I always tell them, I don't want to give you the same feedback a peers already given you. That's not a good use of my time. I want you to make those changes first, and then I'll give you another type of feedback as a second loop. So building in that accountability, that's a part of our learning journey, that there's structures and supports in place for them to do that. Not just left to, it's optional. If you'd like peer feedback, come and see the instructor ahead of the deadline. We know that people don't get to that. We need to build that in as the teaching and learning journey. And then in a bigger picture, creating a culture of doing this work, whether that's through portfolios or these 3 examples, student-led conferencing, which is going to support parents to be in that position and give students an opportunity to set goals with support, take responsibility for their learning, understand what their next steps are. Lots of schools are building exhibitions or presentations of learning, where we're sharing our work with an audience that matters, or in a presentation of learning, we're setting goals, we're reflecting on our learning in a bigger sense and moving that learning forward. We need to build this gradual release of responsibility, these structures and systems to support self-assessment into the way we design our assessment practice. And lastly, we need, in this PowerPoint, we really need to think about reporting in a bigger way. I started at the beginning by critiquing a focus on evaluation. And what does it look like? In Rocky View schools, for example, this is their communications of student learning, where they're thinking about ongoing real-time reporting. They now only have one formal report card at the end of the year, but an expectation of using online gradebook to regularly provide evidence and assessment of students, for the next steps in learning, and for parents to see where students are at and have that ongoing finger on the pulse of how students are doing, but connecting that to goal setting, student parent conferences, collecting portfolios where students are collecting artifacts of learning and reflecting on them, and thinking about communicating student learning in a broader way and really welcoming parents into that journey and students into that journey. So it's not some surprise that comes 3 times a year that we then get the information we need to work harder, or we're doing great, let's go to McDonald's, here's your reward, but rather this ongoing journey that we've created tools and processes for people to know where they are, what their next steps are, and really scaffolding that for them. A friend of mine who's a learning specialist recently sent me this, just thinking about, they use my blueprint, but thinking about how, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook might be tools to support ongoing updates of what's going on in the classroom, so that, again, we're thinking not about assessment as this one-shot deal, but as a conversation that we're welcoming stakeholders into, and a learning journey of growth, ownership, responsibility, and learning from feedback. Okay, I mentioned that this is to help you identify some tensions or some theses, some big ideas. Here's some that I'm wrestling with right now. I have this belief that, as I've mentioned all through this PowerPoint, that my job is to support students to achieve their goals, but then I'm trying to do that within a culture where we're working within competition. So, with that tension in mind, what are some possibilities? Well, I'm trying lots of formative assessment strategies. You'll receive individual feedback from me. I build peer and instructor critique into the assignments and the development sequence. Trying to explore how we can still, at the end of the day, as I mentioned, provide you with a fair and accurate evaluation of how you've done relative to the criteria that will produce a GPA and fit in with that larger structure. But along the way, how do I focus on helping everybody move forward with their learning and be as successful as they can? I feel like that's a big idea that I try to design for. Here's another tension that I'm wrestling with. I know that what I really want is for you to be able to use this in your teaching, right? I want you to be able to take these assessment ideas and work with them in your classroom. But our assessment, the way our program is currently structured, this course sits separate from field, and field sits separate from the rest of your career, and so there's this bit of a disconnect there. So while I'd love to be able to see how you then use assessment in with students and build that as the real performance assessment, how do I design assignments that are closer to what teachers make? How do I try my best to create relevant deliverables for you, and that are authentic to the discipline? In this case, I didn't even get to design those, because this course outline is done for all sections of this course. But then how do I even interpret the things that were being given with this in mind? Again, attention and possibilities that I think of. Lastly, I know how important feedback, relationships, and trust are to feedback. Yet we have these close timelines. I mean, we've got this online context. So what am I trying? I'm trying to create videos. I'm trying to experiment with audio feedback. I'm trying to reply to your posts all through the process, not just when I'm giving you specific summative assessment. I'm trying to just try to be helpful and bravely trying to say, hey, here's what I think you need to do next, and doing that with compassion and empathy. Really trying to over communicate in time so that you know why I'm doing what I'm doing and how I'm doing it. I'm trying to, like right now, tell you I know I need your trust, and the feedback is intended to help you improve. So yeah, these last 3 examples are just meant to reveal to you a little bit of an example of like what your thesis could look like, or what my thesis might be if I was making an infographic. I would then need to support this idea of feedback requiring trust, or a need to support all students to achieve their goals, and what that might look like through formative assessment. I haven't fleshed those out, but I just wanted to start getting you thinking about what are these potential big picture visions of assessment practice that you might identify for your infographic. These are mine. I want you to come up with your own. You'll then support those with some suggestion, some of the research that we've done. And then you'll think about, well, what are ways that you could work towards that? And then you'll present that whole story in an infographic. And I hope this little lecture is giving you some things to think about, some notes to identify, some possibilities to inquire into more along with your glossary. Yeah, I hope you're still with me. This has been uh, probably a long video, um, and we're going to keep working with it more, but I hope it was somewhat helpful. Okay, bye for now.